look at some of the specific challenges to the Messiahship of Yeshua. And we looked at some of the clearest passages being in the book of Isaiah about the servant of the Lord, Hebrew Eved, the servant of the Lord. Passages we looked at earlier from Isaiah 42 and 49. The 50th chapter is another one about the servant's suffering. And then the end of 52 through 53, all talking about this servant of the Lord. The traditional Jewish response is, yeah, but that's got nothing to do with Jesus. Those are national promises to Israel. They refer to Israel as a nation, Israel as a whole. And they would say, just read through Isaiah 40 to 55, and you'll see the servant of the Lord is always Israel. Let's just examine that. Many of the best insights I've gotten through the years have been by means of a concordance. The theme on which I ultimately wrote my doctoral dissertation on Hebrew and Semitic words for healer, healing, in particular the root rapha in the Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East, that came to me, some of the insights, the scriptures began to open. I was on my knees praying about some issues relative to God's healing with my Hebrew concordance open, looking at verses when I began to look at the usage. Look at that. So this is not one of these mysterious things where we have to wonder. Even if you just have an English concordance and take the word servant or servants and look it up, or just read through. If all you can do is read through in an English Bible and mark each time it occurs, you don't have to speculate. Sometimes I'll be teaching our students to say, okay, well, what happened in that passage? I think it was, if I remember, I said, tell you what, there's a great biblical interpretation principle called look it up. You don't need to speculate or wonder or guess. Look it up. Read it. I would be thrilled beyond words if traditional Jews would simply read through the Hebrew Scriptures, asking the question, could this be Yeshua? I don't want anyone to just believe my argument. I want people to study and look and read with an open heart before God and see where the truth leads them. So, servant of the Lord in Isaiah. Servant of the Lord, Hebrew Eved, is mentioned a total of 17 times in Isaiah 40 to 51. I mention this because 40 to 51 immediately precedes 52, and it's 52:13 to 53:12, which is the great battleground. I mentioned some of the anti-missionary material early on, the multi-tape series of Rabbi Tovia Singer, where he deals with this. He actually takes 2 whole CDs to deal with the subject of Isaiah 53. That's how big an issue it was there. If you look down on your notes, challenges to Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12 from the Jews for Judaism website, look at all these objections. Down onto the next page, why it can't be Jesus. Now these are done, I'm not laughing at them, these are done with great sincerity of heart. And I know some of the people that work on this website are very sincere people and knowledgeable in different ways. I'm not laughing at them. I'm just saying it's so amazing to see how many issues have to be raised, how many potential problems there are that you never knew existed, having read the passage over and over and over and over. You didn't realize why it couldn't be the person. It's almost like if you're a married man, I've been married now 30 years, here's my wife sitting next to me, and someone's going to explain to me why that's actually not my wife. Give me various proofs and listen, I know my wife. That's my wife. The same way, 2 CDs to try to show why this cannot be Jesus. That's one of the examples of nothing plus nothing plus nothing equals nothing, no matter how sincerely it's done. So we just want to look at this first question now. The servant of the Lord in Isaiah. Who is the Eved? Eved is mentioned a total of 17 times in Isaiah 40 through 51, sometimes with reference to the nation of Israel as a whole. So I won't read all of these, but you have your references there. And I deal with this in volume 3 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. But for example here, Isaiah 41:8, V'ata Yisrael avdi Yaakov asher b'charticha. And you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, Zerah Avraham, Ohavi, seed of Abraham, my friend. So here's a clear reference. It goes on again. God says to him, Avdiyata b'charticha, you're my servant. I've chosen you, v'lo masticha, I won't refuse you. So many places, it's clearly speaking about the nation as a whole. And I list them, all these verses here. Sometimes with reference to a righteous individual within the nation. As we saw, for example, Isaiah 49:3, where the servant is called Israel, and yet in verses 5 through 7 has a mission to regather Israel. Or Isaiah chapter 50, verse 10. So, Mivachem Yareh Adonai, Shomea B'kol Avdo. Who among you, so he's speaking to his own people, who among you fears the Lord and listens, obeys his servant, listens to the voice of his servant. Goes on there. And the 50th chapter itself with some vivid descriptions into the 51st chapter. So sometimes it refers to a righteous individual. In several cases, it's not clear whether an individual or the nation or righteous remnant within the nation is referred to, although a good case can be made for the individual interpretation, like Isaiah 42:1 that we looked at earlier, or 44:12. But here's what's interesting. If you go through all your references, take your concordance, just check, just read them all through, this is what you'll find. The most personal, specific, individual language is found in Isaiah 52:13 and 53:11. Okay? So very specific personal references. Okay? 52:13, 53:11. If you take a look just at 53:11 specifically. From the suffering of his soul, he will see or be satisfied. By his knowledge will my righteous servant make many righteous, and he will carry their iniquities. There are different ways to divide the Hebrew words and translate them, by the way. This servant here, 52:13, 53:11, if you go through the passages leading up to it, here's what you'll find that's very interesting. You go through every reference, you'll find that the last time there's any reference to the nation clearly as the servant is 48:20. Okay? If you'll just go through it, check it when you get home, do a little study. You know, the verses like, you are my witnesses, Israel my servant, things like that. You don't find any clear language like that after 48:20. So if you just take a look, chapter 48, verse 20. And it ends there, this word, Imru Ga'al Adonai Avdo Yaakov. Say, the Lord has redeemed his servant, Israel, Jacob. There's a clear reference. When you get into the 49th chapter, it starts to get very individual in a way that none of the previous passages were. And then it calls the servant Israel and then says that its mission is to redeem and regather the people. And then if you just look on with me, I'll just read here from the NIV for simplicity and time's sake. Chapter 50, starting in verse 4. 49, very specific individual personal language about relationship with the Lord and dialogue with the Lord and a mission to restore and regather Israel, and yet God's going to make him a light to the Gentiles and bring salvation to the ends of the earth. The sovereign Lord has given me an instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being taught. The sovereign Lord has opened my ears. I've not been rebellious. I've not drawn back. I've offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. This is a more individual picture than you'll find in Isaiah, speaking about the nation or the nation speaking itself. This is an individual speaking. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I have set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. Verse 9, it's the sovereign Lord who helps me. Who is he that will condemn me? Verse 10, who among you fears the Lord and obeys the word of his servant, namely me? Let him who walk, and it goes on from there. So here the servant spoken of in very individual terms. And then we get into the end of the 52nd chapter. And we come to those verses, see my servant will act wisely, raised, lifted up, highly exalted. Just as many as were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured, and so on. And he's going to startle or sprinkle many nations. And he's going to carry our infirmities. He's going to suffer. He's going to die. He's going to have his life preserved. God speaks of him as my righteous servant. By his knowledge, he'll justify many, and God will highly exalt him, as a result of which shouts of praise and adoration come in the next chapter. Interestingly, there are Jewish traditions that interpret Isaiah 52:13 and following with reference to the Messiah. In other words, they didn't say if it says servant of the Lord, it must be Israel. Why? Because they recognize that servant of the Lord could refer to the nation as a whole, or the righteous remnant within the nation, or the righteous remnant of one. But suffice it to say, the argument that the servant of the Lord in Isaiah is always the nation of Israel is false. Sometimes, clearly, definitely, it refers to an individual who works for and among the people of Israel and the nations. Therefore, that objection, which is constantly raised, is not only contrary to scriptural evidence, it's contrary to some Jewish traditions that recognize, for example, Isaiah 42:1, behold my servant, as referring to the Messiah. Or Isaiah 52:13 about my servant will be exalted, that refers to the Messiah. Even followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, that claimed that he was the Messiah, when he had a stroke in the early 1990s, I believe in 1992, when he had his stroke, at the age of 90, they began to point to Isaiah 53 because he couldn't speak. And they said, see, he's like a lamb, he's smitten, he can't speak, and point to this passage. So I even talked to some of their rabbis when I was 18. I made reference to earlier this morning in my own testimony. When I talked to some of their rabbis, they said, it's messianic. We believe it's messianic. Right now, Messiah is suffering in heaven, and he's mourning and grieving for our sins, and so on and so forth. They had no problem interpreting it in a messianic fashion. So the idea that the servant of the Lord in Isaiah always refers to the nation as a whole is false and contrary to the scriptural evidence, and even contrary to some Jewish tradition.